Hey everybody, welcome back to Modo with Ellery, and in this episode we're going to be looking at kind of the basics of replicators. And like many topics here in Modo and 3D and visual effects in general, this is going to be a multi-part topic, so we're not going to cover everything about replicators in one sitting, but we're going to look at some of the basics of getting started and some useful ways that you can approach working with replicators to facilitate your creation of a lot of different types of scenes. So let's just start by looking at some of the real basic stuff here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and just drop a sphere into my scene, and there it is. So we've got a little sphere here, and then just so that we have something to replicate and then a place to put it, we're going to need two items. So we're going to use this sphere is going to be where we're going to put stuff, and then we're going to create another sphere, which actually let's just take and create here like this, and this will be what we will replicate. Now, one thing to note is when we're actually working with the initial just basic replicator item and the tools and things that we have inside of that, we really don't have much control over the overall scale of what we're working with. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by scaling this one down significantly. And I'm going to give it kind of a droplet shape, just just because why not? And so I'm just going to select the loop around here, and I'm going to shift up arrow until I get kind of to the midway section. And then I'm going to use the scale tool and set the action center to selection border, which is going to pop it right up there. And then I'm just going to scale this a little bit flatter. And then I'm just going to shift down arrow to kind of decrease the selection, shift down arrow to decrease the selection. I'm going to do this a couple more times until I get kind of down here. And then I'm just going to flatten the whole thing out. So something like that. And then I'm going to take that and just drop it right up so it's sitting on the ground plane. All right, so now we have a little kind of droplet shape. All right, and then one more time, just for good measure here, I'm going to use the scale tool, and this time I'm going to go to an origin action center, and I'm just going to scale the whole thing down a little bit and then flatten it out just a little, so we've got kind of more of a droplet shape. And then we're going to bring back our main sphere, which you can see now is much bigger, and now this is going to be what we will replicate our little droplet on. So just basics here. Let's go in and let's go back over to the item tab here, and I'm going to go to particles, replicator, and now we have our replicator item. So if you've never worked with replicators, it's one of the great aspects of Modo that I like about it a lot for scene creation and for adding lots of great random detail that would be very difficult to add by hand. And the basic idea is to take a source item, which is going to be in this case our droplet, and then a point source, so it's known as the prototype, is the thing that you're replicating, and the point source, which is going to be the bigger sphere, is where you're placing those replicas. All right. So so in this case, we just want to put this little droplet kind of all over this sphere. All right, so it's a pretty simple task. All we have to do here is go into our instancing menu here with replicators, and you can also do this with nodes, but we'll look at that when we do a more complicated replicator setup here. So let's just start here with the prototype is going to be sphere 2, which is our droplet, which I probably could have renamed, but in a simple scene, this should be fine. And then for our point source, we'll go to the sphere, and now you can see we've got one of those little droplets kind of at every point along the surface of the sphere. Now, a couple of things to notice here, and this is going to be important because we want to understand how the replicator item is working, where it's placing the objects, and just in general what it's doing so that we can have better control over it. So first of all here, I have replicators visible in this top viewport, and so at default, you're not going to see that. And if you press the O key over any individual viewport to get the properties, you'll see that in the drawing and control section there's a section here for replicators. And I've got it set to all, and this is going to be what replicators are actually drawn on screen. If I change this to none, you'll see that all of those change to bounding boxes. Now, the bounding boxes obviously are going to run much more quickly on your GPU. They're going to be less of a strain on your system, so it's going to be easier for you to kind of see the general placement and, roughly the orientation, because you can see each of these cubes has its own orientation, the direction that it's facing. And in the case of a replicator using just geometric point data, what it's going to do is it's going to take the surface normal, so the direction that the surface is facing at each individual vertex, and also the average for rotation, and that's how it's going to apply the position and the rotation for your replicated items, for your prototypes. So you can see here as we move around, we get some of these are faced a little bit more diagonally. As they're going right up and down these seams, you see that they're faced straight up and down. And then here around the top, they're faced straight up and down. So you kind of get the idea of how these are being oriented. Now, in this case, since they're round, you wouldn't notice that unless we have the bounding box on. So the bounding box is going to give us a good idea of the orientation. All right, so we have a few different options, though, for how these are actually drawn. So that's actually going to be, we're going to walk through some of the basic settings here. So the first thing is going to be the source mode. And right now it's set to align to surface, which is exactly what I had talked about. Takes the normal for each vertex and applies that for the position and the orientation of our prototypes. So in this case, let's go back and make those visible here. So I'm going to take replicators and I'm going to set it back to all. And now you can see that each vertex here has its own replicated droplet on it. Okay. So if we change this from align to surface to point data, you can see it's just going to use whatever the vertex is, but then it's going to leave the initial orientation that your base item has, that your prototype has. So in this case, they're all facing so that the droplet flattened part is down on the bottom, and then they kind of go upwards. So you can see they orient that way. All right. We also can choose to use polygons, and the only difference between this and the point data is that it's going to be using the center of any individual polygon, and you can see that it's also going to change the orientation. And here, let's go back and change the redraw here back to none, because you can see there is a bit of a different orientation because vertices align differently than polygons. Polygons, since in this case they're almost all quads, they have 4 edges and 4 vertices to define each polygon, so it has its own facing direction and orientation, and each of these is going to base off of that. So they're going to look a little bit more grid-like in their orientation. Their placement is not much different. Basically, they've been offset from the corners or the vertices into the center of the polygons, but it's not a big difference as far as placement goes, but that orientation definitely looks different. So you can see if I change this from use polygons to align to surface, and there's definitely a change in the orientation. And then the other option we have, which is going to be nothing in this case, is going to be use particles, which, because there are no particles in this layer, there's really nothing to see. So let's change this back here, and I can change it back to align to surface so we can see this. And I'm going to make my replicators visible again so we can see them here. So, so there we go. We have our basic replicators, and we see a few issues here. And before we get down into some of these options here, let's look at some of the problems that we have. Now, when we have the kind of more spaced out versions here around the midsection, we get enough space that there's only a little bit of overlap, so that's fine. But once we get up around the top, they overlap a whole bunch, and we start to get a lot of jumbling up in the spacing. So the only way that we can deal with that, if we're just working with a basic replicator like this, is going to be to decrease the size. So let's go to Sphere 2 here, and I'm going to go to Polygons, and I'm going to use the scale tool, and let's just scale these down a bit. And you can see that by scaling the base one, the prototype, we've scaled all of these together. And I'm going to make it quite a bit smaller here because we're going to mess a little bit with the scale. So let's go down to something like that. There you go. And so now let's go here. Let's go back to the replicator item and look at some of the other things that we have. So a couple of things that we won't need to worry about in this case are going to be these 2 checkboxes for include child items. So if you have a hierarchy, for example, then you'd want to check that if you want to include it. So, say for example, if you're going to replicate a bunch of cars across a parking lot and they had wheels that were independent mesh items and they were all parented into the base item, then if you don't check this box, then those aren't going to be included. And then you also have use prototype transform, which is going to have to do with some of the transforms of the actual item. And again, we'll look at that when we get into a little bit more complex use case. Then we have just some basic things here. So we have render visibility, and that's just like with any other item, it's whether or not it's going to render. And we have the options for making these dissolve. We have the render density, which right now is set to 100%. And if I turn this down, you'll see that we start to lose some of the replicated items. So if I go down to, let's just go to 50%, now half or only half of the vertices are actually going to contain a replica. All right, so well, we're at 47%, so slightly less than half. There we go, there's 50. So yeah, now half of them have a vertex with a replicated item. All right. Now, the difference between the render density and the display density is that the render density you can think of kind of as the master toggle. This is going to be, what percentage of the vertices have a replicator. End of story. Now, with the display density, it's actually a multiplier of the render density. So, if I take my display density and I move it down to 50% as well, you can see now we have only a quarter of the vertices have an actual replica. But if we go over to the render view here, which let's hop over to right now, you can see that this goes back up and we see kind of the appropriate amount because the display density doesn't come into play at render time. The display density is only for the real-time view. All right, so we can put that back up, and let's also put our render density back up as well. And then there is the density, the render multiplier, which isn't going to come into play in this account or in this case, but we'll look at that a little bit later on. But basically, it just gives you some more control over what you see in OpenGL versus what renders. All right, so let's hop down here, and we can see now we get into stuff that allows us to create some variation for our scene here. So let's go ahead and just make this a little bit bigger, and let me make my inactive meshes the same as active here. There we go. And so what we have here is we have some options for, first of all, we have random seed, which if we have every vertex being covered with a prototype, it doesn't really change anything. Now, if I change this down to, let's go back down to 50%, now the random seed, if I change this, is going to change which 50% of those vertices is going to contain a replica. So you can use this to kind of cycle through and find something that you like. I think I kind of liked 408. I think it was a little better distribution. But you can use this to kind of shake things up if you've got relatively your replicator working, but you don't like which vertices are receiving which replica, if you happen to have multiple replicas or anything like that. So now we have some options, and this comes into play when we want to have something a little bit more organic going on, and we don't want to have kind of a straight grid-like pattern. So what I'm going to do here, actually, let's hop back over to the Model tab real quick, and I'm going to go to this empty mesh item, and I'm just going to create kind of a big grid here, and I'm going to give a 16 by 16. That ought to do. And then I'm going to hide this sphere. All right. Notice if you hide the point source, the replicas stay. So that's kind of a cool thing to note here. Now let's hop over to the render tab again. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change to use my plane here, because it's going to make some of these things a little bit more obvious. So let's go and change my point source from sphere to mesh. And now you can see we've got this semi-complete grid of replicas, and so this is where the random offset can really come into play and be very helpful to create something that looks a little bit more randomized. So let's say I wanted these to be something like pebbles along a road. This doesn't look anything like pebbles because they're just absolutely uniform. So let's go ahead and take my render density. I'm going to decrease it to something like 20%. All right, now still, it's a little better because there's less of them, but it's still not really working for me. And actually here, let me hide my my main prototype. But here you can see that we still kind of get the feeling of this being very grid-like. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change the random offset in order to give these a little bit better random distribution. So in this case, I don't want them to move at all in the Y because I don't want them to move off the ground, right? But I want them to give a little bit more space in the X and the Z. So I'm going to put something like 0.25 in the X and the Z, and now you can see we get definitely a lot more randomization. Now the downside is we will sometimes see overlapping of items because they're shifting in their space, so you might have to be careful with your random offset in order to keep things from overlapping. But let's go and we can check different random seeds, and there we go. That one actually works, I think, pretty well. We have a couple of little bit of overlaps here, but I think if we take these down to maybe 0.2 by 0.2. That should cover most of that. Yeah, there we go. So you get the general idea here. You can use this to kind of give a little bit of randomization to the scene. And if you're dealing with a large, either a flat surface or a surface that doesn't have a lot of vertices, this can be really helpful. Or if you have a lot of vertices and you're using a low render density, this can also be very useful because it's going to give you a little bit more of the look of something more randomized. If you want to get more randomized than this, we'll look at actually using some shader tree techniques, and we'll look at that in the next episode of Replicators. But in this case, we can also look here. Let's look before we go on and see we've got random twist, which in this case is going to mean almost nothing because these are these are round. So if I add random twist in the X and the Z, it's going to look a little weird. So let me give it 45 and 45. Since these are droplets, now they look a little bit off. Now, if you have something that's mostly round and you can keep it on the surface, then that kind of random twist can help a lot. In this case, they just look like they're kind of nudged up and down, and that doesn't work very well. So let's put that to 0 and 0. Now the other option you have, and this works well with something like trees or bushes or something where you have kind of an organic shape, if you add some random twist on the Y, it's going to rotate it just around the Y-axis, and so you can get different orientations of your objects, and that way you can make one tree look like more trees. And then the last one here that we'll look at is the random scale. So if I were to set this down to something like, let's go to 50% on all axes. Now we have, from the basic size of the prototype, we have 50%. They can get smaller, so they can go down to 50% the normal scale, or they can go up to 150% of the original scale. So that, again, gives you a little bit more variation. That might be a little bit much, so I'm going to change it down to 25. All right, and that's a little bit better. And then the other option you have here that's checked on is uniform scale, which is going to allow you to make the items not stretch. If you turn that off, you can see you get this amount of various scaling that happens independently within X, Y, and Z, which if you have something that is more organic, like a rock or something, that should be fine. But in the case of something more uniform, that you'll notice that squash and stretch, then that can be something you definitely want to leave on. All right, so, like we've talked about here, the basic idea is that, a replicated item with just the replicator gives you a lot of things that you can do, but it lacks the ability to give you something that looks kind of truly organic in its placement and orientation. This can, however, be very useful in some use cases, which, if you're doing something like laying out a city, can be extremely useful. So let's actually hop up here, and I've got this replicator city start file, which we've got our, this is going to be our big central tower. This is going to go at the middle of our city. And let's hop back over to the model view here so we can see all this together. So we've got this tower, and what I've basically done is I went to the layout tab, and there is a whole folder of skyscrapers, and I took skyscrapers 8 and 9 were a little bigger in footprint than the other ones, so I used those to make kind of our large central tower. I kind of put the two together, added in a few kit bash items and some stuff like that, and then I've got all of the other items here. And let's hop back over to the model tab so we can see this. And let's hide our central tower for a moment. So I've got all the other items here. And basically, these are just different shapes and heights of skyscrapers that we can use to replicate a city. All right, so let's look at how we would actually do that. And we're going to just make a really basic city. You can obviously take this technique and go a little bit more nuts, get a little bit more creative, and make some interesting stuff. But basically here, we'll look at how we would lay out a city. Now, one thing you'll notice here is on each of these items, I have taken the basic skyscraper shape, and I've extended the bottom of it down about 20 meters. So this is going to allow me to give some random height, some random Y position to my skyscrapers that will make them appear as if I have a bunch more different heights, even though I have just only, let's see, we've only got these items right here. So, it's not that many items. It's only 7 of them or 8 of them. So we've only got 8 items, and that's not enough to give really the feel of a city. But if we use a little bit of randomization for position, and then I'm going to use a little bit of random scaling on the Y, so the height can be a little bit different, but not too much because I don't want them to look too smashed or too stretched. But between those two things, we can actually make something that looks fairly interesting. So let's go ahead here and let's get our basic grid set up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create just a big grid here. So let's put this at 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to make it 1.5 kilometers. So we're going to make this pretty big, 1.5 kilometers. And then I'm going to give it, let's try 64 subdivisions. And, oops, should have clicked it there first. 1.5 kilometers. There we go. All right, so now we have our grid. And what I'm looking for with the grid here is, you can see I've got 64 segments, but what I'm looking for is if I place any of these individual items on here, I don't want it to butt up against the one that's next to it. So right now it's 64 subdivisions. That's a little too much. So I'm going to back this off to 48 by 48. And now I just want to see that basically, for the most part, each one of these buildings would fit into an individual polygon space. They're going to land on the vertices, but generally they want to fit within a polygon because we're going kind of half of the edge length around each vertex. And so something like this ought to be okay. And this gives us, a lot of room to create some buildings. Now, if I wanted to, I could make this a bit bigger here. Let's actually go a little bit bigger. Let's go to 2 kilometers. So I increased it by 1/3, so let's increase this by 1/3. Actually, we're going to go back up to 64, looks like. There we go. Not quite. Let's try 60. There we go. Got a little tiny bit of breathing room. All right, so that's going to work for us. So we've got our basic shape here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a replicated item. Now, one thing you'll note here is in my haste to create this beautiful city layout, I took and I added this plane into the same mesh item as one of the skyscrapers. So I want to cut that out and paste it into my just empty mesh layer, which I'll just call layout. Okay, and now I need to make a group. So what a replicator is going to look at is going to look at an individual item, but if you want more than one item that's going to be randomly placed around, you have to create a group. So I'm going to take these, and for the moment, I'm going to make them all visible, just so I know I've got them here. And then I'm going to go over to groups, create a new group, which I'll call buildings, and I want to create it from the selected items, and we'll click OK. And now we have this building group that has 8 items in it. Perfect. Now, one note is if you want to have one building show up more than the others, you can just take and duplicate it here inside of this group. It will create a duplicate in the item list as well, but that will allow you to have, say if I wanted building 10 to show up twice as much as the other buildings, I could duplicate building 10 and put it in twice. And one thing I would really like to see in Modo here, and maybe it's coming in a future version, I would love to see it, would be kind of some sliders or something that would allow you to get a little bit more control over these. So, maybe this one has 25% probability, and this one has 10, and this one has 5, and, so you could have some more control that way. But, it's easy enough to just say, okay, I want building 10, 5, and 1 to all be twice as prevalent as the others. So I just duplicate them, and I have 2 copies of them inside of the group. So just a side note there. So let's go ahead and close that down. And now that I have that group ready, let's go ahead and I'm just going to hide all of these now. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to add a replicator. So let's go to particles and replicator. And for my prototype, I want to choose that buildings group. And for my point source, I want to choose layout. And we'll see that pretty lickety split. I've got a fairly substantial city that has been created here. Now, with all the shaded replicas, this is getting to be a little heavy on my GPU. So usually it's going to be a good idea to just kind of have a look here. You're not going to get a ton of navigation done when you have something this dense, but just a note there, you want to pay attention to that. But while I'm still moving things around and making adjustments, I actually do want to leave this here. So let's go into the replicator item then, and I'm going to look at a few other options that we have here. Now, one thing that we didn't mention, let me close up the transform right now. One thing that I didn't mention is we have the option here for random 90-degree Y rotations. And this is great for more, fixed things like buildings, non-organic items, because if I click this, every one of the items can now randomly rotate in 90-degree increments, and it's going to give me the effect of having, buildings facing different directions, which is super helpful in something case like this because, we don't want all of our buildings facing the exact same direction. Now, you also recall I mentioned that I added 20 meters of kind of underground legroom here, and that's going to allow me to take my my random offset, and I'm not going to go quite to 20 meters. I'm going to put 18 meters. And then that's going to move each individual replica up or down somewhere within 18 meters. So I've got a 36 meter range now of extra height that I've added in here. All right, so let's go another step further here, and I'm going to add some random scale. Now, like I said, I don't want to stretch this out a ton, but I do want to see some randomization here. So let's go ahead and put maybe 15%. I don't want to go too much more than that because it's going to become very obvious that my buildings are stretching out. All right, so I think that in general kind of gives me a really good look, and I'm going to go ahead and just press O here, and in drawing and control, I'm going to turn my replicators back to none, so I just have wireframes, or bounding boxes rather, and you can see, kind of get the idea here. It's relatively interesting. Now, one thing that I may want to do here, though, is control a little bit more of the density. So what I'm going to do before I move on is I'm going to take my layout here, and I'm going to duplicate it, and that's going to give me essentially one version that I will show and one version that I will hide for my ground layout here, because what I want to do is I want to create some streets. Right now this looks like a city that's so dense that, you know, there's maybe a little bit of walking space in between some of the areas, but really I want to get the feeling that there are, you know, some actual streets here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here, and I want to leave, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices or 4 edges, and then I'm going to take one and I'm going to cut it out eventually. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to select that one. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll select the next one. Now, since Modo can use a pattern for selection, all I have to do is hit the up arrow, and it's going to skip 4 and select the next one. So let's go all the way up here, and maybe I'll leave that last one out. And now I'm going to press L, so it's going to select that entire series of edges, and I'm just going to hit delete. And lo and behold, we start to get some streets through here, and you can actually see them as we go by. Now let's do the same thing here vertically. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll select that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll select that one. And then again, I'm going to just up arrow my way over to this edge, press L, and press delete. All right, so now we've got something that actually, you know, works relatively well for kind of city blocks. All right, so let's continue on a little bit more. I've got my my central tower here, which if I bring up is going to fall right here in the middle. And you notice I don't have quite enough space here to get this to fit in. So what I'm going to do, nice thing is it doesn't really care if I have n-gons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go select these edges here, and I'm going to hit delete. You can see it's gotten rid of some of those. And I'm going to select these two here and hit delete. And now I've gotten rid of those. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my central tower. It's going to be a little off from center, but that's okay. And I'm just going to place it right in here. This might be a little bit of a snug fit, so I may want to go in and delete a few extra vertices. So here, let's go back into the layout here. And let's say maybe I want to get rid of these guys here. And maybe these guys here. There we go. And the other thing that I can do is I can also go in here and I can hit the random seed. So I can change these until I get you know, some good placement and orientation. I think that works good. Got a little bit of daylight all around, and overall everything is working pretty much how I would like it to. Okay, so now the nice thing about this also is that you can use this to adaptively change you know, however you're going to work with things. So let's go in here, and I'm going to take, and for the moment I'm going to hide my replicator, and I'm going to take layout and layout 2 because I want these to both work together here, because I'm going to end up hiding the main layout. And what I want to do is I want to create this city kind of on a hill. So I'm going to make the center part higher than everything around it. So I'm going to go to my fall off. I'm going to create a cylinder fall off, then just grab the move tool. And then I'm going to change my shape preset to smooth, so it eases in and eases out. Then I'm just going to pull up. I don't want to go too high here. Let's go up maybe 100 meters, which is pretty high. It's going to increase the height of this building significantly. And let's change our axis to Y. There we go. So now it's a hill. So we're going up and then back down. All right. And also, let's go ahead and drop my tool here. I'm going to grab my central tower, and let's move it up 100 millimeters or thereabouts. Maybe I'll leave it down just a little bit so we get a little bit of overlap. Yeah, I think that works. And now let's go ahead and bring our replicator back. And there we go. Now we'll notice though that now all of our buildings are kind of leaning, so it looks like there was a pretty severe earthquake, which isn't what I want here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my replicator again, and I'm going to change my actual default source mode here from align to surface to point data, and then all of those buildings are going to stand straight back up, and we're pretty much ready to go. So let's hop over real quickly here to the render tab so we can get an idea of what's going on. Let me switch this bottom view to the camera, and let's get a nice shot here. Maybe I can see the central building, something like that. And then I'm going to hide my street layout, or the main one here, and I'm going to bring the render up, and now we can see that we've got this pretty complex city built really in just a few minutes. So if you were to take time to either build, some more variations of the buildings, maybe you want to take and build 2 or 3 variations of each building where you change some of the facade, maybe change the texture, change out the look of the windows. You can see on this main tower I took and I made all of the concrete kind of a darker metal instead of the concrete. But overall, if you went and took each of these and created some variation on each one, maybe had a few extra skyscrapers, you could pretty quickly come across with a decent city that's going to be pretty well laid out, and you can do a lot of interesting shots with this, especially if you're just using this as something in the background. So you could use this as the basis for something off in the distance, and it very easily will hold up. Now, obviously, the closer you get into items, the more detail you have to add in. But, for just a quick layout, especially if I'm just roughing this out and I want to get a general idea for a layout of a city, then I think this is going to work pretty darn well. So that does it. That's the start of looking at replicators. The next time we look at replicators, we will look at controlling them with the shader tree so that we can get more random variation and some more organic placement of our items. But that does it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see some more work with replicators beyond just the next episode, where we'll be looking at some more randomization. If you want to see some more use in a larger scene, let me know in the comments. If you like this video and you'd like to see more like this created, please visit my Patreon account, patreon.com/Ellery, and there's also a link down in the video description. Or if you'd just like to get the source files for this a la carte, you can get those on Gumroad, and that will also be in the video description as well. So that does it for this one. Happy replicating, and I'll see you next time.